Okay, let's get started. There's a couple of things I want to remind you of in preparation for the next week when we have the test and the policy analysis, thesis, and outline due. And that's all it is. It's the thesis and outline. We'll talk about that in a second. I'm going to share a screen with you. If you haven't printed this out, the Fall 2020 Micro and Macro Assignment Guide, it's not too late to do it. It's still there. When you go into weekly assignments, there's a link to it, and it'll bring it up in Excel. This week we're covering from 831 to 906 is chapter 6. Then on 8:7 to 9:13 we're dealing with the test 1 and the thesis and outline. There's something else I want to bring to your attention to make sure you're prepared for it. We are on holiday. On the 7th. So there's no assignments for the 7th because it is a holiday, but things will open up on the 7th. It will not affect the due dates. The due dates will still be Sunday night, 11:59. In addition to that, when we look at the assignment guide, I have opened everything from chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. They are now open. So if there's anything you need to go back and look at or review, all of those chapters are open. You can retake the quizzes, look at the video walkthroughs. There's a bunch of tools in there that can help you prepare for the test. So I want you to have the access to all of them. They will still stay open until I believe I got 9/11. They'll close on 9/11. The test is due on the 13th at 11:59. Hopefully everybody will have at least one attempt completed by Friday. Now with the thesis and outline, if you want to know what is expected, go to policy analysis. There's the rubric for the assignment. We'll open down. It goes through the step-by-step process of the assignment, construction of the report. Here's the rubric that explains different levels of grading. According to this, the lowest grade I can give is a 20 if you submit it on time. But I do want it submitted prior to Friday. That way I have time to look at it. There's some links here that can help you setting up a policy analysis. What is a policy paper? Knowing how to write a policy paper, tips for writing a policy analysis. These are all tools to help you get through the process. I want you to select your own topic. Think about a policy or a regulation or legislation that has been enacted but needs to be removed, or vice versa. There's something that's been discussed but not put in place, and you want to determine the outcomes if it were to be implemented. There's a lot of things to talk about. There's been a lot of stuff going on with COVID. the different governments and how different state governments are handling it, how the federal government's handling it. So there should be no shortage of coming up with topics for this paper. I also give you examples. There's some thesis and content links. If any of these links do not work, let me know. They occasionally change the addresses, and I'll just have to go find it and relink it. Here are examples of the thesis and outlines. This is very simple. They receive full credit. It doesn't have to be long and drawn out. I just want to know what policy you're looking at and how you're going to approach it. Sometimes you'll have a policy and your hypothesis will be it'll be a positive impact. But when you do the research, you find out it's a negative. Don't change your thesis statement. And you get to the conclusion, state that it was found not to be damaging or consequential, whatever you want to say. Because a lot of times research, some of the best research is finding where things don't fit together. They answer more questions. Here's another one. This one's quite detailed. I believe it's this one. It was the HB2 legislation. They already have a lot of detail in here. But just putting in transitions and full sentences and complete sentences, and they're probably about through writing the paper because they've got all that there. Because I can see their sourcing, which is not required, but they decided to do it. They collected some data. So this individual is ready to write. And the next step would have been the peer review. Here's some other final paper assistance. Let's see. Well, these are final papers. Well, it's just instruction on how to write a strong paper, and I have additional links in here as well. You go through the Room Resource Center, JCC library, they have materials as well. Especially when you get to working on your works cited pages, they have MLA source generators. You put your information in there, it'll set up correctly, and you just copy and paste it out. So there's a lot of them available to you. The earlier you set it up into the discussion board, which I may open up in the middle of this week for the thesis and outline, the sooner I can respond and you can start on your writing. You still have to submit it via Mankiw in the weekly assignments. There are limits to what you can submit. I'm going to do all my grading and commentary and discussion board. All I need you to do is submit your name, title of your paper, and hit submit. Should be a very simple process, but that's not going to open up until the 7th. I will give you a reminder of when that is, when it's up, and what you need to do. Okay. Any questions about the thesis outline process and when it opens and closes and what to do? I have no from Alexis. Anybody else? Nobody else? Okay. If you're just shy, you want to answer the question, let's ask a question. Just send me an email and I'll respond. We'll get everything cleared up. Okay? So, getting away from this, we go to weekly assignments and we go to week 4. There's only one chapter. That should be chapter 6. If you see anything other than chapter 6, we got a problem. Just let me know and I'll fix it. So let's look at what's going on in chapter 6. In chapter 6, we're looking at supply and demand and government policies. We know how supply and demand works. If there's an increase in income, a normal good, the demand will increase. Likewise, if the income goes down, the demand will decrease. If the supply let's say Hershey's Kisses, if the price of sugar goes up, the supply of Hershey Kisses will decline, which means it moves to the left. And if the price of the sugar goes down, the supply will move to the right, which is an increase in Hershey Kisses. But in chapter 6, we bring the government into this equation. It's not just the free market of the invisible hand, as Adam Smith described in The Wealth of Nations. Now we're getting into a situation where the government establishes price controls for whatever reason. And there's a law called the Law of Short-side Domination. The first curve intercepted by the price level will dominate. So if the price is above equilibrium, as we see right here, the quantity demand will dominate. The suppliers are willing to supply the goods at a higher price because this line is defined by their willingness to sell at zero economic profit. We do have suppliers that have the ability to sell at lower prices. But at equilibrium, this is the number of suppliers that will supply the goods. When the price of the goods goes up, which is the market price goes up, they're willing to make more units. But what happens is we now have a situation and here we end up with a surplus of goods because the supplier is going to produce this number, the buyer is going to purchase this number. So all these additional items that are purchased are going to be a surplus. And as we talked with Adam Smith's invisible hand, this is the hand or market forces. If there's nothing in the way, if there's no government action or interference or price controls, the market will force this price back down to equilibrium. Will it be an instant thing that occurs? No. What will happen, people will vote with their dollars and cents and their feet. They'll walk away from the product. And then the only way that the suppliers are going to get rid of that excess is to decrease the price. So it doesn't matter how many they want to supply that price, the consumer is only going to buy X at $4. Now, on the other side, and this would be what we consider a buyer's market. There's excess supply. They have to drop the price to reduce quantity sold. Now, over here, you have a situation that's very similar, but on the opposite end. This is what will be supplied. The supplier is going to say that's all the unit produce. And the consumers are going to say, I want a lot more. So what we're going to have is a shortage of goods. And an invisible hand is also going to get involved here, trying to drive it back to equilibrium. If there's no government forces in play, it will go back to this point. But we end up with a shortage of goods, and the only way the consumer will buy them now, it's a seller's market. The buyers are going to have to pay the price going back up to the equilibrium. So from $2 to $3, they're going to have to, they'll bid on it. The consumers will affect the market and bring it back to equilibrium. But that's as long as it's just the buyers and sellers. Now, if we go to the regular, traditional, or interactive PowerPoint, these are the four things that are going to be discussed in this chapter. These are the four things you need to know and understand when you get to the test. You need to know what are price ceilings and price floors, and you know examples of each. Price ceilings hold prices down just to protect buyers. Price floors lifts the price up or supports the price to protect sellers from unfairly low prices. You want to know how price ceilings and price floors affect market outcomes, how do taxes affect market outcomes, and how do the effects depend on whether tax imposed by buyers or sellers, and what is the incidence of tax and determines the incidence. Those are the questions that will be answered. Now, as we talked about earlier in the chapters, economists are policy advisors. Use theories to help change the world for the better, based on their understanding of economic activity. And policies often affect everyone. The legislature, the school board, town councils. Policies are usually implemented by those groups, and they are the architects. But as economists, we're going to determine the outcomes. That's very similar to what we're talking about with the policy analysis. We also want to know how it alters market outcome. The best thing I can say there is remember the law of short-side domination. If the price is above equilibrium, quantity supply will dominate, quantity demand will dominate. That means there's going to be a surplus of goods. If the price is less than equilibrium, the quantity supply will dominate. They're not going to produce as many goods as you want as a consumer. We're going to deal with price controls and taxes. Very simple. Legal maximum on the price at which a good can be sold, and rent control laws are part of that. Price floors is the minimum price of the product or commodity to be sold. That's where you see minimum wage laws. And we'll look at the impact that they have as well and who they have the impact on. They surveyed a bunch of experts, and they talked about rent controls. They wanted to know if they had a positive impact over the past 3 decades on the amount and quality of broadly affordable rental housing in the city that have been used, that have used them. And most of the economists, or a large number of economists, 95%, disagree. So they believe that these rent controls have actually harmed or created negative impacts. And we'll look at a supply and demand curve and see if we can understand how that works. Now we have 1% who agree that everything's better because of it. Paul Krugman is an economist. I know he was in that 1%. 4% don't understand, are uncertain, and maybe just because they're reading something else into the statement or think something else should be there. So let's look at the graph. If we look at Raleigh, even Charlotte, there's a higher demand for apartments because it's larger the population of individuals desiring these apartments. Now, if there's no price controls, if the rent is $800, 300 units will be produced. Now, we do have consumer surplus. We have people willing to pay much more than $800, but there will not be as many of those units produced at these higher prices. Some people want lower, and there's not going to be as many as those. Now, if it's higher, they'll build them, but they're going to be very careful. They're going to be very careful not to go over 300, unless there's a big expectation of change in later time. Now, if there's a price ceiling above the equilibrium price, this is what we call it's not binding. And when the law first went into place in New York City, where they established the rent control boards, this is what existed. The rents were very high for very substandard living. They were having people renting a cot on a bunk bed in a basement for 8 hours. And after 8 hours, it became somebody else's property. So they could fill that cot 3 times a day and get 3 times the rent. But in this situation, the price of rent is below the price ceiling, therefore it's not binding. No one is impacted by it. I wouldn't say no one, but the vast majority will not be affected by it. Now, if you're looking at high-end apartments, this may be an issue. But there's ways to get around that by creating condos and so forth. Now, if we're looking at the market for apartments and the price ceiling is below the equilibrium, we now see that quantity supplied is much lower than the quantity demanded. So all this is going to be a shortage of goods. The consumer will not see. Now, there may be market forces trying to drive it up, but due to the fact that this is a legislative action or a regulatory action, there's nothing that's going to happen because of this pressure to move upward, because the standard is set here. in New York City, they have a rent control board. And what they do is determine how much rent can go up per year. And it's made up of politicians and renters. They make up the major of that board. So they're not going to want to raise the prices. The people that are renting, they don't want to see their prices go up. So they're always going to vote to keep them down. And over time, this gap is just going to get further and further apart, and the shortage become greater and greater. There are not many contractors or developers willing to build at this price. So that's when you see the government, the city, and the state have to come in and build apartments or public housing, because the suppliers and developers are not going to produce those goods. So this is binding. There are individuals that probably started renting their properties in New York in the late 50s, early 60s. They may be paying $600 a month. They may have started out at $300 and maybe at $600. Or may have started at $200, now they're $600. But the market demand for those apartments is much higher than $600. And even when we just look at this, these are worth $800. If you went to find an apartment in New York City, you'd be very lucky to find a decent apartment for less than $3,000 to $4,000 a month. So if they are at $500 or even $800, you see a lot of them are now using this. They're subletting their properties, which is illegal if you get caught. But they're subletting apartments at that $3,000, $4,000 price range, and they're still paying $800 in rent. And they're using the other as part of their retirement fund. So, and it can be a very generous retirement fund. So if you hear that they're planning to vote on changing the law of rent control in New York City and allow the equilibrium to find its place, and it'll go over it, and it'll come back, may go above and below a few times until it closes in on equilibrium. And then developers will be willing to build, but it's going to be very difficult for those individuals that were at the lower rate to make that difference in the payments. So it would be very difficult to undo this. The government would have to step in and say, well, if you're paying $800 now, it's $2,400 will make up the difference. But it's a very difficult thing, and it's been in place so long that it's going to be hard to deal with. So in the long run, you're going to see a situation where there will be limited production of apartments in New York City. And they're showing 500 and 800 between these two. In New York City, it's probably, the market demand is probably 25, 3,000 a month minimum. And if the person is paying 500, that's a big gap. Most of the developers in New York City are building condos and then selling the condos. I looked at one condo in New York City, and it was near Central Park, well, within a few blocks. No view per se. And it was going for a little over $1 million. And it was 1,500 square feet, 2 bedroom, 1 bath. And then you had to pay an upkeep fee or a building fee of about $3,000 a month. The developers can make more money doing that than renting apartments and dealing with the rent control board. Because the rent control board does not impact those businesses that are selling the condos. Because of the shortage, sellers must ration goods among buyers unless somebody else comes in and produces housing in that marketplace or whatever product it may be. And we can look at rationing, which will create long lines or queues. We see that in healthcare and some of the nationalized healthcare systems. The only way they can maintain or maintain lower costs is to ration the goods. And they have long queues waiting for care. In the United States, right now, we don't have that. I had to have a couple of surgeries. I went directly to the surgeon and said, this is what I need. He agreed. And we scheduled the surgery. And I told him that if anybody got sick and couldn't make it, let me know and I'll take their spot. Within a week and a half, I was in getting the surgery. That would not happen in Canada or Great Britain unless I had enough money to buy the doctor out of the system. You also see discrimination according to sellers' biases. It can be from their long-time clientele. They'll take care of them, but they're not going to take care of anybody else. And it could be extremely unfair and inefficient. Because it says the goods don't go to people that value them the most. Any questions on rent control price ceilings? Like I said, they hold it down. You do have to remember the difference between non-binding and binding. On a price ceiling, if it's above equilibrium, it's not binding. If it's below equilibrium, it is binding. It's preventing the price from going to equilibrium. Okay, all of you should have ability to chat. I'm going to ask you a question and just type in your response. What percentage of the American workforce do you think works at minimum wage? It can be 0 to 100. What percentage of the workforce? Okay, I got 35. William, the bonding, if the price control affects the market, it is bonding. So if it's a ceiling and it's below equilibrium, it's bonding. If it's a floor and it's above equilibrium, it is bonding. Yeah. 35.
So if it's anywhere
excuse
Martin.
me?
So if it's above equilibrium at all, it's binding?
Only if it's a price floor.
What do you mean by price floor? Say that again.
Okay.
I didn't catch it the first time.
All right. If you look at the graph on the left on the screen, right here, the price. This is a price ceiling where they control the price to protect buyers from unfairly high prices. But
so
right here,
this
is what the market is say is bonding. Is 800. Anything 800 or below is bonding. Anything 801 or above is not bonding. Because there's not a lack of apartments or anything else. Because here with it at 1,000, The supplier is going to build a larger number of apartments. There will not be a shortage. It's not binding. So if the price goes down to 500, now this is the expected return that the seller would hope to receive because that's the equilibrium. But the price is below the equilibrium and there's a shortage of goods. This is binding.
But wouldn't it mean if the price is going down, there's an excess of goods in the open market?
If the price is going down, no, it doesn't necessarily mean that unless the supplier is reducing their cost to get rid of surplus, or if their cost to produce the good goes down and they're willing to give you more, which would be a supply shift to the right. If we're looking at just a stable market and then an external factor such as the government comes in and puts in a price control, there's going to be a binding situation and a non-binding. With a price ceiling is telling them the most that they can charge for those apartments. So the suppliers between here, between the equilibrium
Who sets the
and
equilibrium?
$500, these sellers of goods, they're gone. They're not willing to produce any product at that price. So this is a binding situation. We
Who
are
sets
actually
the
in with
equilibrium?
150 versus 450 units.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Who sets the equilibrium, or is that just
The
where the
market,
profit starts?
the market sets it. As a supplier, if I put goods on the shelf and I put a $5 price on it, and I come back a week later and they're all gone, and I was told they were gone on the first day, I'm probably underpricing my product.
Okay.
Now, if I come back in a week and all the product is still on the shelf, obviously the consumer does not think it's worth $5.
Yeah.
So the market itself will tell you the business what's going on and the consumer to some degree. But the business is more involved in the marketplace than the consumer. I guarantee you the people that produce salt are keenly aware of the process to produce salt. 98%, unless you watch how's it made or whatever on TV, have no clue on how they produce table salt. So they're keenly aware of the cost mechanism. So if the price is below equilibrium, they're just going to say, no, thank you. This group here. Now, there's still a group down here that's willing to sell. This group of suppliers is gone. Does that make sense?
So I understand. Thank you.
So this is bonding here. And this is what we consider a market failure. Because if we draw a line through the equilibrium and down, so anything that happens in this area,
Mm-hmm.
to the left of this, or even to the right, let's say they produce too many goods, that is a market failure. Only time there's not a market failure is if we're at or around equilibrium.
So I know a guy who sells like T-shirts and stuff, and he ordered too many T-shirts, so he had to sell them at a much cheaper cost than what he normally. So he sold normally for $50, and they started selling for like 30 because
Yep.
is that a market failure?
Yes.
Okay. He had like an extra 200 accidentally, so he started selling them for cheaper. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that is a market failure.
Okay.
Now the next time you won't order that many.
Yeah.
Okay.
He won't.
All right. So let's go down to the next one here. This
Yes,
is
sir.
dealing with market for unskilled labor. I'm looking at the numbers here. Not quite as high as my traditional classes normally are. Ethan is at 5%. Where'd that come from, Ethan?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so my assumption was that most people who are not operating, like they're being paid at minimum wage are probably the youth, because by the time you're older, you're more able to get a better job. You probably have education or more experience, which will get you more payment. So my thinking was, if it's mostly just the youth that are being paid minimum wage, and it's not even all youth, then it's probably not a very high percentage of the population that's actually working at minimum wage.
Allison, you had 40%. Where'd that come from?
I said 40% because I don't think that it's like mainly just the youth. I think it's a lot more people than we usually think of that are working minimum wage jobs.
Okay. Is that something that you were that you heard from somewhere, or is that something that you read?
I just see it on the news a lot that people, they struggle that are paying rent, and that's not just the youth.
Okay. Well, Ethan was closer, but still too high. It normally runs about 2 to 3%. The American workforce works at minimum wage. That includes wage staff that's working on like 256 plus tips. They're reporting greater than minimum wage. Half of the individuals who work for minimum wage live in households that have income in excess of $100,000. So those are youth that are working part-time. Now, are there individuals that are struggling at minimum wage? Yes. And the big thing we have to understand is this term, unskilled labor. That's who's working at minimum wage. Like Ethan said, once they acquire skills, their wages go up. And if the wages don't go up with these new skills, they find another place to work that will appreciate it. Now, right now, it's a difficult time to be. I wouldn't be out there trying to find new jobs. I wouldn't quit my job until I found a new job. Let's just say that, because the market is somewhat difficult right now. But if you look at this situation, where the price for minimum wage is 7 and the market rate is 9, the market rate exceeds the price floor. Therefore, it's non-binding. Now, some roles are reversed when we look at wages, minimum wage. You are the worker. You supply your labor to the market. So you're now the supplier of goods. If the market equilibrium is $9 an hour and they offer 7, there's not going to be a lot of people that work at 7. They're going to wait, see if the market pushes up to here, because in this situation, yeah, it's non-binding. Because most of the hourly workers are going to be getting $9 plus an hour. And the ones that paid 7 could actually be in legal difficulty for doing so. So this is non-binding. So even with a price of 7, the demand for workers can be around 500 units, because the demand curve is now set up by the business. They may want to hire a lot of workers at this level, but they're not going to get them. And that's a non-binding price floor. Now, when we have a binding price floor, looking at unskilled workers and minimum wage, if the minimum wage is 10.25 and the market rate is $9 an hour, you may have a lot of workers that are willing to work at this new rate right here. Remember, you're a supplier of labor. But the businesses are saying, nope, I'm not hiring anybody at that new rate. So it's a market failure. We have a shortage of workers, of 400. The businesses are not going to demand the number of workers. And if we look at the law of short-side domination, the first curve intercepted by the price level will dominate. We have a lot of people that want to work for this new wage because this group of people from here to here are now interested in working with that increased wage rate. But there's not going to be any jobs there. Let's say that I have a company and we dig ditches, and I have 100 ditch diggers, and they all have custom-made shovels to maximize their efficiency. And with those workers, I can build a 100-foot, 6-foot by 6-foot ditch in 8 hours. What I have to do as a business, I have to determine the cost of labor. If the cost of labor is $9 an hour, I got 100 workers, that's $900 an hour, 8 hours. That's my daily cost. So my revenue has to exceed my daily cost. Now, if I'm still using those workers and the minimum wage goes up to 10.25 or 11 or 12 or whatever, I now get in a situation where I have to do a cost benefit analysis. It may cost me go from 1,000 or 10,000 a day to dig a 100-foot 6x6 ditch. It's going to cost me, with that labor, it's going to cost me $12,000. And the market's only willing to pay $11,000. I have to look at alternatives. So I go look at a backhoe. And with that, I figure out the payments and the cost per hour of usage, et cetera, and it brings me to $8,000 or $9,000 a day. As a business, I have to make that decision. So those highly skilled ditch diggers are no longer going to be employed. I'll give them their shovels when they leave, but every ditch digger that's using manual labor is going to find the same situation when that wage goes up. I went to a seminar, online seminar, and there was a gentleman who was speaking about artificial intelligence, and the term, the minimum wage came up in the question to him about what he thought the impact would be with artificial intelligence. And he said increasing minimum wages is the best friend of artificial intelligence. He said, go to Seattle, go to San Francisco, and these other cities that have raised their minimum wage to $15 an hour. Go to the fast food restaurants, which in the past have been major employers of unskilled labor. They no longer have a waitress. You just have a little kiosk that you put your information in, what you want. A few people in the kitchen put it together, and you get it in a bag, and you're gone. So those companies in those areas have had to make some difficult decisions. Primarily, find a cheaper way. And if it's cheaper to have the kiosk there and the consumer do their own input, so be it. To some degree, you can see it in Walmart, self-checkouts. Reduce the number of of cashiers that are needed. Because they can have one or two individuals watch 6 or 7 machines. So it usually surprises people when you hear that the unemployment rate, the number of workers working at minimum wage is so low. And it's like we heard that Allison believed it was that high because the way it was presented in the news. And that's not her fault. I would assume that it was an intentional omission by the media to some degree.
I have a question.
Excuse me?
I have a question.
Yes,
So
sir.
when you say minimum wage, you mean 7.25. So, but someone that makes 7.26 would not be considered minimum wage, but yet they're only making a penny more, or 8.15 or 7.50, making 25 cents more per hour, and they're not considered the minimum wage, but yet they struggle too, right?
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
But if we look at the income levels of households and so forth in the United States, and we look at incomes, a lot of those individuals in that introductory area, even if they get a raise a penny, it may not count exactly to the number, but it's still not going to be a large group because a lot of them will be part-time. And they're in school or some other college or whatever. The original intent of minimum wage was a training wage. It was not ever designed as a living wage.
I didn't think it was.
But a lot of people, based on what they see over and over again, think that it is. I've had people that honestly believe that 60 to 7% of the American workforce worked at minimum wage. And it was because of what they had heard and what they had seen on print and media. That was the perception they had. It doesn't matter if I agree with the numbers or not. When somebody starts throwing bunches of numbers up there and making big statements, I'll look it up before I start debating them or anything else. And it comes from both sides. It's like the old adage, lies, damn lies and sales figures. You got lies, damn lies, and statistics and how they're presented. There's classes on creating surveys that actually you can get the individual to say what you want them to say, leading questions into the major question. So let's look and see what economists say. And we can see that it was a market failure here because whatever happens when we have the price ceiling or the price floor, the quantity we receive is less. It's a short-side domination. And we saw the same thing here. There's the equilibrium quantity, and it was less because of the price ceiling. If the federal minimum wage is raised gradually to $15 per hour by 2020, the employment rate for low-wage U.S. workers will be substantially lower than it would be under the status quo. You can see the economists are all over the place here. That's very subjective when you say over or under the status quo. This is a very subjective analysis. Now you have more that I can say that nearly 40% are uncertain if it has an impact, 30 disagree, and 34% agree, or only 30% of the population disagrees. Only 34% of the population agrees. So the way I present it can affect how it will be received. But like I said, even the experts are law. Now, when we looked at the rent controls, there was just about unanimous standing there. The minimum is the greatest impact on the market for teenage labor, the least skilled and least experienced. When they accept the lower wage in exchange for on-the-job training, 10% increase in minimum wage decreases teenage unemployment by 1 to 3%. And we tend to focus on the short run, but on the long run, it's hard to make any assumptions. Because if these individuals are truly there to acquire skills and knowledge to move up, if we don't track them continuously, we don't know the true long run effects. Education is a good indicator of a better life, or not necessarily a better life, but more income and stability to some degree. Lack of education is a pretty good indicator of earnings over a period of your lifetime. And we're going to look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis at some point during class, maybe even next week when we have time on Wednesday. The one socioeconomic group that really struggles is single mothers without a high school education. That's you're looking at an extremely difficult situation to overcome in the long run. I know individuals that were in that situation that excelled. Some friends, twin sisters, both of them had children coming out of high school. Both of them ended up going to get their GEDs. Then they got their associate's degrees, and they got their bachelor's degrees. One got a master's degree. One worked for the governor of North Carolina for about 20 years as a legislative liaison. The other bought a bunch of dry cleaning stores and runs those. They came out, but there's only a few that you see. So it is a difficult situation. Long run effects: increased quantity supply of labor, higher number of teenagers who choose to look for jobs. The advocates of the minimum wage: one way to raise income of working poor. Workers who earn the minimum wage can afford only a meager standard of living. But as I said, 50% of them live in households with incomes in excess of $100,000. So the standard of living doesn't change for them. A lot of the advocates you see for the minimum wage are labor unions that are hourly workers, where their contracts are tied into minimum wage plus. So whatever the minimum wage is, if it goes from 10 to 15, so it increases 5. If they were at $40 an hour, now they get $45 an hour. They're highly active in this argument for increased minimum wage. Because as I said, it was not designed to be a living wage. Now, the best way to talk about poverty and how to deal with it, we raise the minimum wage, we have artificial intelligence get into play. That causes unemployment of unskilled workers and teenagers to decline, prevent some unskilled workers from getting on the job training. Well, just showing up on time is on the job training. Just doing what you're told is on the job training. Understanding that your earbuds cannot be in your ears 20 hours a day. This is something that has to be trained. Because on the job, the majority of them, that's not acceptable. So a lot of skills have to be developed in this low wage marketplace. It says less than a third of the minimum wage earners are in families' incomes less than the poverty line. Many teenagers from middle class, they're just getting extra money. That's all they want. So they're going to show us a couple of graphs here. And this is price control. So the market for bicycles in equilibrium, as in the graph, determine the effects of a $90 price ceiling and a $120 price floor. So if we go back to the very beginning and we look at ceilings and floors, we have to understand the difference. We do know that if we're looking at the equilibrium, it's $100 and a quantity of 100. Okay, but that's the market doing its thing there. But if we go up to our definition of price ceiling, price floors, the price ceiling is a support. It holds the price, the legal maximum price at which a good can be sold. So they're telling us if we go back to our item and we have a price of 90 and it's a price ceiling of 90, that means we are bound by that price control. Price floor is a minimum on price in which a good can be sold. So they're protecting sellers from unfairly low prices. So with a floor, we're looking at the legal minimum for the price. So now if we go back, look at this graph, it says a $90 price ceiling. So that means all they can charge is $90. And at $90, it means there will be 90 units sold. Because the supply curve is going to be intercepted first. Price ceiling is protecting them. So the consumer can't afford it, so we're just going to hold it down. Business say, well, at that price, I'm only going to give you X, even though the demand for them are over here. Okay. Now, price floor of 120. So we go to 120. Look at what happens. With that price floor, this got us in a situation where the price being high, above the equilibrium, that's the lowest price that can be charged. So the consumers are going to say, I only want 60 bikes at 120. I don't want 100. I don't want 120. At this price, This is what I'm willing to pay. There's going to be a surplus of goods. The market forces won't bring it down. You can't do it. We're looking at this one. It's a binding price ceiling. Because the price ceiling is below equilibrium, it's binding. We look at the number of units the consumer wants. We want 120. The supplier, these individuals right here, these businesses in this area right here, are no longer willing to sell. And this is their break-even point. When we look at the supply curve, if a company, their cost is $95 a unit, they're not going to sell any. But if their cost is 90, they will sell some. If it's 80 or 70 or 60 or 50, they'll sell some. But the number of suppliers available in the marketplace declines because of that price ceiling. And the shortage will get greater and greater because if the equilibrium price goes up and this doesn't move, it's going to be harder and harder to resolve in the long run. Then they come in with the price floor. If the price floor was at, it'd be non-binding. The price rise is 120. The buyer's demand 60 cycles. The seller supplies 120, causes a surplus of 60 units. If this is government controlled, it'll be very difficult to sell these products in this domestic market. So this is a binding mechanism here. It may be that they turn around and ship all the excess goods to another country that is willing to pay the price for them. The markets are a good way to organize activities. We saw that in chapter 1. The equilibriums and the prices, it's experience as a supplier and as a consumer. However, the supplier is more aware of what we do than we are of our own selves. There have been psychological studies where they have looked at manipulating prices and consumers still buying the product. You can have two products side by side, identical, well, not identical, but they're similar and highly substitutable for each other. Say like green beans in a can. As part of a psychological study, they put on one of the cans, they reduced the price 50%. And it didn't change the price. They were still of equal pricing. Consumers bought the one they perceived to be the greatest deal. You go down the cereal aisle, the box size don't change. It may get narrower, but it's not quite as deep, and the consumer don't realize that they're getting less cereal every single time as the costs go up. So it's the old adage, buyer beware. You need to know what's going on. You need to ask questions. Prices have a crucial way of balancing supply and demand and coordinating economic activity, like we talked about at the beginning of class. If we're looking at markets, the business is going to be keenly aware of how many units go and come off their shelves. If nothing moves on their shelves, it's too high. If everything's gone, it's too low. Now, they do bring taxes into the equation here. If the tax is on the consumer side, we'll see a decrease in demand. So when you buy a car, there's a 3% tax you have to pay when you purchase a car. If they raise that to 6%, your demand for those cars is going to go down, or the number of the options will be decreased. If it's on a supplier, you see the tax. If it's on the supplier and it's on their products that they're using to make the pizzas, like the dough or the tomato sauces or the hamburger, the supply goes down. If pepperoni prices go up, you get a large pepperoni, you may have, yesterday you had 30 slices of pepperoni, today you may only have 24. So the supply they're willing to sell is diminishing. So you just have to remember, where's the tax applied? To the consumer or to the business? And in the tax, it creates a wedge. This is lost due to inefficient operations. Because if they put a tax on a product and this is the quantity that we will get, the price may be $10 at equilibrium. The consumer will pay $11 and the business will pay $9.50. They'll receive $9.50. That other $1.50 will be lost to taxes. This will be gains by the government. Look through the one with taxes. We spend a little extra time on the other. Look at these scenarios and how they're set up, who pays the tax. And remember the slope of the curves, they also make a difference. So be mindful of that. Okay? Any questions or comments?